For 3 years, I lived on the edge of town, not quite in it, not quite out, just close enough to hear the church bells every Sunday morning. Far enough that no one's children accidentally wandered near my cabin. I'd learned to measure time by those bells. 7 o'clock for early service. 10:30 for the main gathering. The sound carried across the winter prairie, clear and sharp as broken glass. Every Sunday. The same ritual. I'd stand at my window with coffee growing cold in my hands, watching families walk past on the road below, the Henderson children in their pressed clothes, scrubbed faces shining. Mrs. Morrison with her proud walk, chin high, gloved hand on her husband's arm. Men tipping hats to each other. Women gathering in clusters like birds, their laughter floating up to my window, never toward my cabin. Never toward me. I was Apache by birth, Christian by conversion. I belonged fully to neither world. My grandmother raised me on stories and beadwork, on prayers to spirits that lived in the land. Then the missionaries came when I was 16. I'd listened to their words about a God who loved everyone, who saw the heart beneath the skin. I'd believed them. I'd converted 3 years ago, thinking faith would be my bridge between worlds. I'd been wrong. Faith changed my prayers. It didn't change their hearts. My cabin sat where the town's neat grid of streets gave way to scrub grass and rock. One room, a good stove. A bed my grandmother would have called too soft. I grew herbs in summer, mended clothes for money year-round. The shopkeeper's wife would leave torn dresses at my door before dawn, collect them after dark. Payment in coins, never words. That was the arrangement. I existed in their economy, but not their community. The coffee was bitter. I'd learned to drink it black after my grandmother died. Sugar felt like a luxury grief didn't deserve. I watched Mr. Henderson lift his youngest daughter onto his shoulders. She laughed, the sound reaching me even through the closed window. I remembered that sound. Remembered when I'd laughed like that, before I understood what it meant to live between worlds. My grandmother's trunk sat in the corner. I hadn't opened it in months. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was the dress she'd spent a year making. Traditional Apache, every bead sewn by her aging hands. The patterns told stories our people's resilience, the land's memory. The refusal to disappear even when disappearing seemed easier. She'd given it to me the week before she died. "Wear this," she'd said in our language. "Remember who you are." I'd worn it to her funeral. Never since. The church bells stopped ringing. The road emptied. Sunday silence settled over the town, the kind of silence that felt full of other people's togetherness. I poured the cold coffee into the basin. Waste. But I couldn't drink it. It had gone bitter the way I had from being left alone too long. I told myself I didn't need their church. Didn't need their community. I prayed alone just fine. God heard me here as well as there. I told myself this every Sunday. Every Sunday. I wondered if I was lying. 3 years of this. 1,000. 95 days of being close enough to hear their lives, but too far to live one of my own. I'd stopped counting the days sometime in the second year. Started counting other things instead. How many words I spoke each week. How many times someone met my eyes in town. The numbers were always small. The afternoon stretched ahead. Empty as all my afternoons, I'd mend the Henderson dress, make soup for one, read my Bible until the words blurred together. Maybe walk to the creek if the weather held. The same routine that had kept me breathing for 3 years. Breathing wasn't the same as living, but I'd forgotten the difference. I washed my cup, set it to dry. 1 cup, 1 plate, 1 set of utensils. Everything in my cabin spoke of solitude. I used to set 2 cups out. In the early days, a habit from when my grandmother was alive. from when I believed someone might visit. I'd learned, now I set one, then, December of 1885, everything changed. Not because the town changed, because I did. The knock came on a Tuesday afternoon, unexpected as summer rain. I froze, halfway through stitching a torn hem. No one knocked on my door. People left things on the step and hurried away. I checked the window first. A young man stood on my porch, hat in hands, Pastor Williams. He'd arrived in town 6 months ago, replacing the old pastor who'd supervised my conversion. I'd seen him from a distance, too young for the job. People said, too idealistic. He greeted everyone the same way, which made folks uncomfortable. Equality felt radical when you'd built your comfort on hierarchy. He knocked again. I had no choice but to answer. "Good afternoon," he said when I opened the door. His smile was nervous, but genuine. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're not." The lie came easy. Everything felt like an intrusion when you'd learned to expect nothing. "Can I help you?" "Pastor, may I speak with you for a moment?" I stepped aside. He entered carefully, like my cabin might break if he moved wrong. It was tidy. I had little else to do but keep things clean. He sat when I gestured to the chair by the stove, perching on its edge like he might need to leave quickly. "I wanted to extend a personal invitation," he said, "to our Christmas service. Christmas Day, 10:30 in the morning." The words didn't make sense at first. I heard them, but they didn't land. An invitation, personal, to church. "That's kind of you." I managed. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. "I'll consider it. I'd be honored if you came." He turned his hat in his hands, around and around. "Everyone's welcome in God's house. I mean that. Everyone." Such an easy word when you'd never been no one. "Thank you, Pastor Williams. I appreciate the invitation." He stood, seeming relieved the conversation was ending. "I hope to see you there. Truly." I walked him to the door, watched him head back toward town, his long stride eating up the distance between my world and theirs. He didn't look back. People rarely did. I closed the door and leaned against it. My heart was beating too fast. An invitation in 3 years. No one had invited me anywhere. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt suspicious. Kindness, I'd learned, often came with conditions. The softer the voice, the sharper the expectation hiding behind it. What did he want? What did they want? Proof. I'd fully converted evidence. I'd abandoned my grandmothers. Weighs a demonstration of gratitude for their tolerance. I sat back down with my sewing. My hands shook slightly. I set the needle down before I could prick myself. The invitation sat in my mind like a stone in my shoe, small but impossible to ignore. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed imagining it, walking into that church, every head turning. The whispers I couldn't quite hear but could certainly imagine, sitting in the back pew, silent and grateful, proving I could fit into their mold, singing their hymns in their language, praying with my head bowed like theirs, being the kind of convert they could feel good about. I could do it. I'd spent 3 years learning to make myself smaller. I could shrink down further if needed. But something about Pastor Williams's eyes haunted me. He'd looked hopeful, not pitying, not superior, genuinely hopeful, like my presence might actually matter to him. Like he wanted me there, not as a token or a project, but as a person. I'd forgotten what that looked like on someone's face. Hope directed at me. It had been so long. I got up in the darkness, found my grandmother's trunk, opened it slowly, the hinges creaking their protest. The dress lay folded inside, the beadwork catching what little moonlight came through the window. I lifted it out, held it against me, walked to the small mirror my grandmother had given me. For the first time in 3 years, I recognized the woman looking back. The question was, did I have the courage to let anyone else see her? The answer came 2 days later at the general store. I used the back entrance, as always. The unspoken rules were clear. I could shop, but quietly, early or late, never during busy hours. I could speak when spoken to. I could pay and leave. I'd learned these rules through silence and turned backs, through the language people speak when they won't use words. Mrs. Henderson was at the counter, talking with the shopkeeper's wife. They didn't notice me in the back corner, examining fabric I couldn't afford. Their voices carried. "Did you hear Pastor Williams invited that Apache woman to Christmas service?" My hand stilled on the fabric. "No." The shopkeeper's wife's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow got louder. "Well, whatever is he thinking? He's young, idealistic. He doesn't understand how things work here." Well, a pause, heavy with implication. It'll be interesting to see if she has the sense to decline. Or if she comes, what she'll wear? They laughed, small, knowing laughs that said everything about what they expected, what they'd accept, what they wouldn't. I left through the back door without buying anything. The walk home felt longer than usual. The wind cut through my coat, but I barely felt it. I understood now. The invitation wasn't kindness. It was a test. They wanted to see if I'd learned my place. If I'd show up grateful and diminished, wearing their kind of dress, speaking their kind of soft, apologetic words. I reached my cabin and stood in the doorway, looking at both dresses. I'd laid them out that morning, unable to help myself, planning, preparing, hoping. The gray dress hung on the left, plain, high-necked, buttoned to the throat. The kind every respectable woman in town wore. Modest, invisible, safe. I'd bought it the year I converted, thinking it would help me blend in. It hadn't. But wearing it to church would send a message: I accept your terms. I'll be what you want me to be. On the right, my grandmother's dress. The one she'd spent a year making, her old eyes straining in lamplight. Every bead sewn with love and stories. The pattern spoke in my people's language, the language I'd been trying to forget. This dress said everything the gray one didn't. It said, I remember. I honor where I came from. I am Apache and Christian both. I knew which one they wanted me to wear. The choice should have been easy. 3 years I'd played by their rules. It had earned me nothing but the edges of their world, the back doors of their buildings, the silence of their streets. I'd converted. I'd moved to their town. I'd learned their language, their customs, their faith. I'd given them everything except the one thing they really wanted: my complete erasure. I sat on the bed, touching the beadwork. My grandmother's hands had created this. Her hands that had held me when my parents died. Her hands that had taught me to identify herbs, to track deer, to pray to the spirits in the land. Her hands that had never asked me to be anything but myself. You can't build a future by denying your past. She'd said once. I hadn't understood then. I was beginning to understand now. The gray dress was a lie. Not a complete lie. I was Christian now. That part was true, but it was an incomplete truth. It erased half of who I was. It pretended my grandmother had never existed, that my people had never existed, that the first 16 years of my life hadn't happened. I thought about Pastor Williams's eyes. That genuine hope. Maybe he'd meant the invitation honestly. Maybe he hadn't known what the town expected. Or maybe he had known and extended it anyway. Either way. The test wasn't just about church. It was about whether I'd keep erasing myself for the possibility of belonging. Whether I'd trade my whole self for a partial life, whether I'd spend the rest of my years trying to forget my grandmother's face. I hung the gray dress back in the wardrobe, closed the door on it, but I couldn't quite bring myself to commit to the other choice yet. Courage. I was learning. Doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, like beadwork. Stitch by stitch. Bead by bead. Decision by decision. I had 2 weeks until Christmas. 2 weeks to decide if I'd walk into that church as the woman they wanted, or as the woman my grandmother raised. 2 weeks to find out who I really was. The days before Christmas moved slowly, each one heavy with decision. I watched the town prepare for the holiday, but I watched differently now. 3 years I'd looked at this place through the lens of my rejection. Now I looked through the lens of a question, were they all the same? I saw Pastor Williams every few days. He greeted people on the street. The banker got the same warm hello as the washerwoman. He stopped to talk with the elderly black man who swept the church steps, actually listening when the man spoke, when children ran past. He remembered their names. One afternoon at the general store, I'd started using the front entrance. As small rebellion, a customer complained about the Mexican family that had started attending services. They're taking up space. The man said, God's house ought to be for God's people. Pastor Williams set down the hymn book he'd been examining. His voice stayed calm, but something in it sharpened. God's house has infinite space. It's our hearts that are too small. The store went quiet. The complaining man muttered something and left. Pastor Williams went back to examining hymn books like nothing had happened. I bought my flour and coffee. As I paid, he caught my eye and smiled. Not a pitying smile, not a superior smile. Just a smile between two people sharing space in the world. I started to think, maybe his invitation had been genuine after all. Small things accumulated that week. The shopkeeper's daughter smiled at me when her mother wasn't looking. Quick, nervous, but real. An old cowboy I'd seen around town for years tipped his hat to me on the street. A child waved before her mother pulled her away. These weren't acceptance, but they weren't hostility either. I'd been so focused on the ones who hated me, Mrs. Morrison and her circle. The sheriff with his cold eyes, I hadn't noticed the ones who might not. 3 years of counting enemies. What if I'd miscounted everything? I began preparing the dress. Small tasks that felt like decisions. I mended a tiny tear in the hem, polished each bead until it caught the light. Washed my hair with the traditional herbs my grandmother had taught me to make, yucca root and juniper. Each act of preparation was an act of commitment, even if I didn't fully know what I was committing to yet. One afternoon, I went to the creek to gather water. Another woman was there, Apache, from the reservation. We stared at each other across the water. I never saw our people here. She was young, maybe 20, here to trade goods in town. She spoke first, in our language. The sound of it struck me like a physical blow. I'd heard nothing but English for 3 years. You're the one who lives in town? Yes. Why, she didn't mean it cruelly? Just curious. I had no good answer. I converted. I thought what? That I could belong to both worlds. She filled her water skin, studying me. You can't hide from yourself forever. I tried. Went to the mission school for 2 years. Came back. You know why. I shook my head. Because I was Apache there and tried to be white. I was white there and felt Apache. Either way, I was divided. Better to be whole somewhere than half everywhere. She left. Her words stayed. That night, I took out the dress and tried it on. Really tried it on. Not just held it up. I braided my hair the traditional way, the way my grandmother had taught me. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time in 3 years, I looked whole, not invisible, not diminished, not apologizing for existing, whole. I stood there until the candle burned low, memorizing that woman in the mirror, memorizing how it felt to recognize yourself. I'd spent 3 years fracturing into pieces, trying to be palatable. Looking at my reflection, I couldn't remember why I'd thought that was living. 1 week until Christmas. The dress hung ready. All I needed now was the courage to wear it. But courage felt closer than it had before. Each day it built, stitch by stitch, like beadwork. Each small kindness in town, the smiles, the nods, the tipped hat added a bead. Each memory of my grandmother added another. The woman at the creek had added several. Maybe I was finally creating something strong enough to wear 3 days before Christmas. The town held its early celebration held early, so families could travel for the holiday. I almost didn't go. But something in me needed to see them all together one more time before I made my final decision. I wore the gray dress, hair pinned up, covered. I was testing something, though I couldn't name what. I wanted to see if anyone would notice me trying to fit in, if anyone would acknowledge the effort. The town hall was decorated with pine boughs and candles. Families clustered in warm groups, children running between their legs. I stood at the edge, where I always stood, watching. The smell of cider and cookies made the air sweet. Laughter echoed off the walls. I was 10 feet away and might as well have been miles. Pastor Williams found me there. "I'm glad you came," he said, and seemed to mean it. "Would you help the ladies with the decorating?" It wasn't really a question, but his tone made it feel like one. Like I could say no, like my choice mattered. I nodded and followed him to where a group of women were hanging garland. They made space for me. Barely. I worked silently, passing pins, holding the garland steady while someone tied it. No one spoke to me directly. They spoke around me, through me, past me. I'd gotten used to being a ghost. Then Mrs. Morrison arrived, sweeping in with her fur-lined coat and her cold smile. The sheriff's wife. The woman who set the social temperature in this town? She surveyed the decorations, nodded approval. Then her eyes landed on me. "Well," she said. "How industrious." The other women went quiet. They knew that tone. I knew that tone. It was the tone that preceded cruelty disguised as commentary. "It's heartwarming," Mrs. Morrison continued, addressing the other women, but speaking about me, to see true Christians knowing their place, understanding humility, understanding gratitude for what they've been given. My hands stilled on the garland. True Christians. Their place, what they've been given. Each word a small cut, precise and deliberate. Pastor Williams's mother was there visiting from back east for the holiday. She was older, gray-haired, with eyes that missed nothing. She'd been quiet until now. "A true Christian," she said clearly, "sees Christ in everyone, even especially those we've pushed to the margins." The air changed. Mrs. Morrison's smile froze. The other women found sudden interest in their decorating. I stood there, pins in hand, not breathing. "Of course," Mrs. Morrison said tightly. "We're all very inclusive here." But her eyes, when they met mine, said something different. They said, "Don't forget yourself. Don't get ideas. Know your place." I set down the pins carefully. "Excuse me," I said to no one in particular, and I left. I made it halfway home before the tears came. Not gentle tears, not quiet tears. 3 years of tears I'd swallowed. 3 years of biting my tongue. 3 years of making myself smaller and smaller until I barely existed. All of it came pouring out. I walked in darkness, sobbing, great racking sobs that hurt my chest. I cried for my grandmother who'd made that dress with her failing eyes. I cried for the girl I'd been before conversion. The girl who'd thought faith would build bridges. I cried for 3 years of diminishing myself and still not being enough. I reached my cabin and collapsed into the chair by the cold stove. I didn't light it. I sat in the dark and cried until I had nothing left. Then, in the silence after crying, a question emerged. Why was I doing this? Why did I care if they accepted me? I could leave this town. Go back to the reservation. Find somewhere new. Find somewhere that didn't require me to erase myself just to exist. Why did their approval matter? I sat with that question for a long time. The answer, when it came, was simple and devastating. Their approval didn't matter, but my approval of myself did. I'd been living half a life, hiding half my identity, being half myself, and it had been killing me slowly. So slowly, I hadn't noticed the dying. I'd thought I was surviving. But survival isn't the same as living. I'd forgotten the difference. I looked at both dresses in the darkness. The gray one that said, "I'll be what you want." The traditional one that said, "I'll be what I am." 3 years I'd worn the gray one. In spirit, if not always, in body. 3 years of contorting myself into their acceptable shape. And Mrs. Morrison's eyes tonight had shown me the truth. It would never be enough. I could shrink myself down to nothing and they'd still see me as less than... The question wasn't whether they'd accept me. It was whether I could accept myself. Whole, undivided. Apache and Christian both. Because both were true. That night, sitting in my dark cabin, I made my decision. Not about the dress that was just fabric and beads. I made a decision about who I would be regardless of what they thought. The dress was just the visible part. But what it represented was everything the right to exist as myself. The courage to stop apologizing for being alive. I'd spent so long protecting my heart. I'd forgotten hearts were meant to be used. The sheriff came the next morning. Christmas Eve. I'd call it later, 2 days before the service. His knock was different from Pastor Williams's had been. Harder. More demanding. I knew before I opened the door that this wasn't a social call. He stood on my porch, hat on, eyes cold. "Morning," he said, not a greeting, just a word to start what he'd come to say. "Sheriff Morrison, mind if I come in?" I minded very much. "But you didn't say no to the sheriff." I stepped aside. He didn't sit, just stood in my small cabin, too large for it. His presence filling all the space. "I'll be brief," he said. "Heard you're planning to attend Christmas service. Pastor Williams invited me." "Yes, well," he adjusted his belt. A casual gesture that drew attention to his gun. "Some of the men in town are concerned. Concerned about safety. About what it means to have..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your kind in sacred spaces. People are worried. You understand. Worried about their children. Their wives." I understood perfectly. I'd always understood. I just hadn't expected him to say it so plainly. "I appreciate your concern. Sheriff, I'm just suggesting, for your own good. You might want to reconsider. Stay home. Stay safe. Christmas Day can be unpredictable. Emotions run high. People might say things, do things. I'd hate for you to get caught in something unpleasant." There it was. Not quite a threat, because he was too smart for that, but a warning, a promise. Show up and face consequences. He was giving me one last chance to choose invisibility. I'll take that under advisement, I said. He studied me, maybe hoping for more, for fear, for submission, for thanks for his guidance. I gave him nothing, just stood there. A small Apache woman in a gray dress, meeting his eyes. He left without another word. After he'd gone, I stood in my cabin shaking, but not with fear, with rage. 3 years of rage I'd swallowed came flooding up. Rage at being made to feel dangerous for existing. Rage at being told my presence in a church threatened children. Rage at having to negotiate the basic right to walk into a building and pray. Rage at all the Sheriff Morrisons who'd decided people like me didn't belong in places like theirs. The rage burned through my doubt like fire through dry grass. They were afraid of me. Not because I was dangerous, because my existence challenged their neat categories. I was Apache and Christian. I was traditional and converted. I was both and in a world that demanded either or, and that terrified them. Because if I could be both, their boundaries were artificial. Their rules were invented. Their hierarchy was a choice, not a divine mandate. I was living proof that their neat little world could be bigger, more complex, more true. And they hated me for it. I went to my grandmother's dress, lifted it from where it hung, pressed it against my face, and smelled the old fabric, the sage it had been stored with, the memory of her hands. My grandmother had survived soldiers and disease and forced relocation. She'd survived by refusing to become invisible. She'd taught me that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. She'd showed me that you can bend without breaking, adapt without erasing, survive without surrendering your soul. I put the dress on, for real this time, not just trying it on. I braided my hair in the traditional way. I stood in front of the mirror and saw my grandmother's strength looking back at me. Her refusal to disappear, her insistence on being seen. The sheriff had come to threaten me. He'd done the opposite. He'd shown me that my authentic presence was powerful enough to frighten armed men. If I could scare them just by existing honestly, what did that say about the fragility of their world? Tomorrow was Christmas. Tomorrow I'd walk into that church, not as who they wanted me to be, as who I was. Whatever happened after, I would face it with my head high and my grandmother's courage wrapped around me like armor. Not armor to protect me from them, armor to protect me from my own fear. I didn't sleep Christmas Eve. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing every terrible outcome. They could refuse me entry at the door. They could surround me, force me to leave. The sheriff could arrest me on some invented charge. Mrs. Morrison could make a scene. The whole congregation could stand as one and demand I go. I could be run out of town by sunset. Each scenario played out in my mind with perfect clarity. Each one ended with my humiliation, my defeat, my return to the edges where I belonged. The gray dress still hung in the wardrobe. I could see it even in the darkness. One choice, and I could avoid all of this. I could wear it tomorrow, sit quietly in the back, disappear into their expectations. I could keep my fragile peace. Part of me wanted that so badly. The part that was tired. The part that had survived 3 years by staying small. But I thought about the next 3 years. And the 3 after that. How many years would I spend hiding? How long could I live divided, fractured, giving pieces of myself away until nothing remained? The exhaustion of code switching, of monitoring every word, of shrinking myself. I couldn't sustain it anymore. Even if showing up as myself cost me this town. Hiding myself was costing me my soul. And souls, unlike towns, are not replaceable. I got up before dawn. The dress waited. I'd prepared everything the night before. Laid it all out like my grandmother had taught me before important moments. First, the ritual. I burned sage in my grandmother's old bowl. Let the smoke curl up toward the ceiling, carrying my intentions. I spoke to it in our language, words I hadn't said aloud in 3 years. Give me courage. Help me remember who I am. Let me honor you, grandmother. Let me honor our people. Then I prayed the Christian prayers, the ones Pastor Williams had taught me, about God seeing the heart, about truth and light and courage, about being made in the divine image, all of us, everyone. Without exception, both prayers felt true. Both were me. I'd spent 3 years trying to choose between them, trying to decide which was more real. But they were both real. I was both and. The divine was big enough for both languages, both traditions, both truths. Maybe that was what I'd been trying to understand all along. I dressed slowly as the sun rose. Each piece of traditional clothing felt like an act of love. The dress first, settling its familiar weight on my shoulders. The beadwork, catching the early light. Each pattern telling stories my grandmother had known by heart. I braided my hair the way she'd taught me, working the long strands with practiced hands. When I was finished, I looked in the mirror one last time. The woman looking back was terrified. But she was whole, undivided, unapologetic. She was my grandmother's granddaughter. She was God's creation. She was enough, exactly as she was. This wasn't bravery. Brave people aren't terrified. This was something else, commitment to truth regardless of cost. Maybe that's what courage actually is. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Christmas morning broke cold and clear. The air had that sharp quality winter mornings sometimes have. Everything outlined with perfect clarity. The church bells began to ring, calling the town to worship. The sound that had haunted my Sundays for 3 years. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, stepped out of my cabin, began to walk, not to prove anything to them, to prove something to myself, that I could survive being fully seen, that wholeness was worth the risk of rejection, that I could walk through that church door as my complete self and the world wouldn't end. Maybe it would change, maybe I would, but I'd find out as myself, not as someone else's idea of who I should be. The walk to town had never felt longer or shorter, both at once. Each step was deliberate. Each step was a choice. I could still turn back. Right up until I walked through those doors. I could turn back, but I kept walking. One foot in front of the other. My grandmother's dress moving with me. My grandmother's courage holding me up. The sun caught the beadwork and made it shine. Families were walking to church ahead of me. I watched them from behind, their backs turned. Children skipping. Women in their fine dresses. Men in dark suits. The picture of belonging. The picture I'd watched from my window for 3 years. Then someone glanced back, saw me, stopped walking. The family behind them nearly collided, stopped too. Heads turned. One by one, like dominoes falling. Everyone on the road stopped and stared. I kept walking. The silence was immediate and absolute. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stood there, frozen, staring at the Apache woman in traditional dress, walking toward their church on Christmas morning. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be fully visible. I'd spent 3 years training myself to be a ghost, to move through their world without being seen. Now every eye was on me, and I felt it like pressure, like weight, like drowning in attention. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was both. Mothers pulled children closer. Men's hands twitched toward hips where guns would normally be. I saw fear on their faces. Actual fear. Of me. A woman walking to church was terrifying to them. That told me everything about the fragility of their world. I reached the church steps. The crowd clustered there, parted without anyone saying a word. Just silence and movement. Bodies creating a path they probably didn't consciously choose to create. I climbed the steps. The church doors stood open. I could hear the organ playing inside. I paused at the threshold. This was it. The last moment I could turn back. The last moment of safety. I stepped inside. The organ stopped mid-note. The single note hung in the air. Then died. Every head in every pew turned. Every single one. A synchronized movement of shock and outrage and fear. The silence that followed was deafening. I'd never heard a silence so loud. It pressed against me like a physical force, trying to push me back out the door. I saw it all in that moment. Women clutching their children like I might attack them. Men half rising from pews, unsure whether to act, unsure what action to take. Pastor Williams at the front, his face pale but his eyes meeting mine. And there, standing up, his face red with rage, Sheriff Morrison. He started toward me. The entire church held its breath. This was it. The confrontation I'd known was coming. He was going to throw me out, make an example of me, show everyone what happened when people like me forgot our place. His boots hit the floor hard, each step deliberate, angry. He was 3 pews away, then 2. Then Pastor Williams stepped forward, not between us, beside me. His voice shook, but it carried, "This is God's house. All are welcome here." The church went impossibly quieter. You could have heard a pin drop in the snow outside. Sheriff Morrison stopped. His face was purple now, rage warring with calculation. Every eye was on him. Every witness watching. The young pastor had just drawn a line in front of God, and everyone... Throwing me out now meant defying a man of God on Christmas morning. It meant showing the whole town what he really was. The moment stretched, pulled. I couldn't breathe. Then, from the back pew, someone stood, an older woman. Pastor Williams's mother. She walked forward, slow, deliberate, every eye following her. She reached the pew beside where I stood, sat down, looked up at me with kind eyes, patted the space beside her. One choice, one woman. One act of kindness that shifted everything. The silence changed. Not to acceptance, not yet. Maybe never. But to possibility. To the recognition that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to be. Sheriff Morrison's jaw worked. His hands clenched. But he turned, walked back to his pew, sat down. He hadn't won. For once. He hadn't won. I sat beside Pastor Williams's mother. My legs were shaking so hard I barely made it to the seat. Tears were streaming down my face, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall. Let everyone see them. Tears weren't weakness. Tears were proof I was alive. The organ resumed. Someone found their place in the music, started playing the processional. Pastor Williams walked to the pulpit. His hands gripped the edges, and I could see them trembling from where I sat. "Let us worship," he said. And we did. The service continued. People sang. People prayed. Some refused to look at me. Others snuck glances. curiosity winning over fear. Children stared openly until parents redirected them. But we all stayed. We all worshipped together. However uncomfortably, in the same space on Christmas morning. When it came time to sing, I sang. First in my language soft, under my breath, the words my grandmother had taught me. Then in theirs, the English hymns I'd learned. Both languages praising the same divine mystery. Both true. Both mine. My grandmother's dress caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. The beadwork glowed red and gold and blue. I sat in that church pew and felt whole for the first time in 3 years. I had walked in as myself. And the world had not ended. It had shifted. Somehow. Or maybe I had. Maybe that's all transformation ever is, having the courage to be yourself and discovering the world makes room. Not easily. Not quickly. Not completely. But room nonetheless. I'd survived being fully seen. More than survived. I'd claimed my right to exist. Authentically. Unapologetically. Completely. The service ended. People filed out slowly. Carefully. Like they were navigating around something fragile. Most didn't look at me. A few nodded. Small acknowledgments that cost them something to give. I accepted them like gifts. Pastor Williams's mother walked out with me. "I'm Ruth," she said. "Ruth Williams? That's my boy at the pulpit." "I know." "He meant what he said. About everyone being welcome." "I know." She smiled. "Good. Then you'll come back next Sunday." It wasn't a question. I found myself smiling back. "Yes, ma'am." Outside, families clustered in groups, talking in low voices. Sheriff Morrison stood with Mrs. Morrison, both of them pointedly ignoring me. Fine. I could live with being ignored. I'd lived with worse. A few women approached Ruth. Not me. But it was a start. Small conversations, small acknowledgments, the world shifting in tiny increments. Not acceptance, not yet, but not outright hostility either. A crack in the wall, light coming through. I walked home alone, but I didn't feel alone. Something had changed. Not them, not yet. Maybe never fully. But me? I'd changed. I'd stopped waiting for permission to exist. I'd stopped asking if I was allowed to be myself. I'd simply been myself and survived it. More than survived. I'd discovered I was strong enough to stand in their silence. Strong enough to face their fear. Strong enough to claim my space in their world without shrinking to fit their comfort. The days and weeks that followed were complicated. Change always is. Some people in town began nodding to me on the street. Others turned away, harder than before. The shopkeeper's daughter asked to learn some Apache words. Mrs. Morrison organized a petition to have me removed from church. It failed when Pastor Williams refused to. Consider it, but the biggest change was in me. I stopped living on the edge of town. Metaphorically, if not yet, physically. I walked into town with my head up. I used front doors, not back ones. I wore what I chose, some days traditional dress, some days their style, sometimes a mixture of both. I was done fragmenting myself for their comfort. Ruth Williams stayed through New Year's. We spent hours talking about faith, about family, about what it meant to be a woman, trying to live honestly in a world that preferred women quiet. She was the first real friend I'd had in 3 years. Maybe the first real friend I'd ever had. Pastor Williams became a friend too. In his way, we talked about scripture, about how the same God could speak different languages, honor different traditions. He was young and idealistic, but his idealism was backed by courage. He'd stood up to the sheriff. He'd stood beside me. That kind of courage was rare. Did the town fully embrace me? No. Change is slow, and people are complicated. Some hearts are too small to expand, too afraid of what expansion might mean. But some hearts opened, a crack at a time. And I learned that was enough. Because here's what that Christmas taught me. What wearing my grandmother's dress into that church taught me: dignity isn't given by others. It's claimed by yourself. I'd been asking the wrong question for 3 years. Not, will they accept me, but can I accept myself? The answer was yes, always yes. Whole, undivided, Apache and Christian both. Because both were true. You can't build a future on denying your past. My grandmother's dress wasn't a costume or a statement or a political act. It was the truth. It was who I was, where I came from, who I'd always be underneath whatever other clothes I wore. And truth, I learned, is the only foundation worth building on. Everything else is sand. Truth is stone. Every Christmas since. I wear that dress to church. Some years there are more welcoming faces than others. Some years there are new people who stare like the town did that first Christmas, confused by the Apache woman in traditional dress singing their hymns. Some years Mrs. Morrison still glares. Some years Sheriff Morrison pretends I don't exist. But I don't wear it for them anymore. I wear it for me, for my grandmother, for every woman who ever had to choose between belonging and being herself. The choice is always the same. Choose yourself. Choose wholeness over acceptance. Choose truth over comfort. Choose the complicated reality of who you are over the simple fiction of who others want you to be. The rest will follow, or it won't. But you'll be whole either way. And wholeness, I've learned, is worth more than acceptance ever could be. Acceptance is conditional, shifting, dependent on others' comfort. But wholeness is yours. No one can take it unless you give it away. And I was done giving pieces of myself away. That Christmas gave me a gift I didn't know I needed. Not a church pew. Not a town's approval. Not even friends, though those came later. The gift was permission. Permission to stop asking for permission. Permission to walk through every door of my life as my whole self, fully, unapologetically, free. My grandmother used to say that our people survived because we refused to disappear. We bent. Yes. We adapted. We learned new languages and new ways, but we never erased ourselves. We never let anyone convince us we were less than whole. I'd forgotten that for 3 years. I'd been disappearing myself, one choice at a time, one compromise at a time. That Christmas, I stopped disappearing. I showed up. I was seen. I survived being seen. And in surviving, I discovered I'd been living wrong all along. Not surviving living. There's a difference. Surviving is what you do when you're hiding. Living is what you do when you're free. I walked into that church afraid. I walked out free. That's the gift. The only gift that matters. The permission to be free in your own skin, your own history, your own truth. No one can give you that. You have to claim it yourself. I claimed it on Christmas morning, 1885. I've never let it go, and I never will.